Episode 47. 1947 marked India's independence and partition. It was also the year of the first televised World Series when the Yankees beat the Dodgers in 7 games. 1947 was when the diphtheria and tetanus vaccine was developed and licensed, and it was also the year when the World Bank made its first ever loan, more than $250 million, to aid France in its economic recovery after World War II. Beyond MD, episode 47, here we go! Hey everyone, welcome back to Beyond MD. Today's topic is trusts featuring the one and only Jamie Golombek. This topic is widely requested. I want to thank all the listeners for reaching out. Special thank you to my good friend Khalil Jivraj, who's been requesting this topic for years, and also to Jazz Kang. So Jamie Golombek is the Managing Director of Tax and Estate Planning at CIBC. He is one of our very top tax experts in Canada. And whenever I talk to him, I'm always so amazed at how much information he can convey in such a short amount of time, which is a true testament to his knowledge and experience. So please note that today's episode focuses more on the technical aspects of trusts. We talk about how to use them for income splitting. We talk about the mechanics of an estate freeze. And we also talk about how trusts can help you to gain more control and even save on probate fees. We do not talk about the setup fees and the legal aspects of trusts, which will be covered in a separate episode. But the more I learn about topics like this, the more I realize how important it is to get the right information from the right people, which is why I am so thrilled to have Jamie on the show. I've also attached his amazing article, which is called In Trusts We Trust, which is a great summary on the topic. It is in the show notes. So with that, here's my interview with Jamie Golombek. Hey, Jamie, welcome back to Beyond MD. It's been, I can't believe it, about 2.5 years since we last chatted on the podcast. I'm really excited to have you back on today. I think most people do know you, but maybe just give us a quick overview of kind of what you do and really what makes you tick.
Sure. Well, I work full-time for CIBC. I've been with CIBC almost 15 years now. I head up the Tax and Estate Planning Group as part of our private client services and private wealth. And I meet sort of with our top clients across Canada to really help them with their tax planning, estate planning. We don't replace, at the end of the day, the role of accountants and lawyers, but what we try to do is give ideas to our clients about what other successful families are doing, professionals are doing to save some tax, make sure their estate planning is in order. And of course, on top of that, I do all kinds of writing. Our team writes 75 different publications on tax and estate planning, all available through CIBC.com under our Smart Advice section. I write the weekly column in the National Post. I've been doing that for over 20 years. That's available certainly online. And of course, I do a lot of public speaking and presentations all about tax planning, estate planning, and things like that for clients right across Canada. But of course, the fun stuff is the private meetings, the client consultations, where we really can suggest ideas and ways that Canadians can pay less tax.
And Jamie, trust me when I say this, like I feel so fortunate to have the opportunity to talk to you about this one-on-one, and you provided just invaluable content over the years for myself and many of our guests. So a big thank you from us. So trusts today, that's the topic at hand. I'm really excited to talk about it. Maybe just give us a quick overview of the different types of trusts. We see a lot of terminology, testamentary trusts, inter vivos trusts, and maybe along the way, you can go over some of the basic definitions. I think that most of us know what a beneficiary is, but maybe the terms of a settlor and a trustee.
Sure. So absolutely. So trusts are kind of unique, right? A trust is not like a corporation. So we think about professional corps and things like that for running a practice. But, a trust is actually not a legal entity. A trust is a relationship. It's a special type of relationship because what it does is it separates the legal ownership of property from the beneficial use and enjoyment of that property. So typically you'd have a settlor who takes property. They would transfer that property, typically cash or investments, into the trust for the benefit of somebody else, typically the beneficiaries, kids, grandkids, charity, things like that. And then it's managed professionally by a trustee. Normally, the settlor is not the sole trustee because then there's tax issues, but maybe they're one of several trustees that would have a majority of voting control, ultimately make decisions about the trust asset. So the trustee legally owns the property inside the trust and manages according to the trust deed, which is a legal document that governs the terms and conditions of the particular trust and what happens to the income of the trust, what happens to the capital of the trust, on what conditions does it get distributed, and to whom does it get distributed. Now, in terms of categories of trust, there's really two types for tax. There's inter vivos, from the Latin while you're alive, which is a trust that you set up while you're alive. Then there's a testamentary trust, which comes into effect only when you die, and that's done with a lawyer. And those are paragraphs inside of a will. So testamentary trust versus inter vivos trust. There used to be, significant tax advantages of testamentary trust a decade ago. Those are all gone. So in most part, trusts are treated as a separate taxpayer. In most cases, they pay tax on their income like everybody else. The difference being that trusts are taxed at the highest rate. So most people try to distribute all the income of the trust out in the year. The trust can claim a deduction for the amount that it pays out. And ultimately, trusts are a flow-through vehicle. So I think in a nutshell, I would say, and even though there's all kinds of trusts, from alter ego trust for probate, we could talk about some of that later, trust for income splitting, trust for professional corps, there's all kinds of stuff. But at the end of the day, the easiest way to think about a trust is use a trust when you don't trust someone. I mean, that's really how I like to think about it. So, you're setting up a trust. Maybe it's for kids, maybe it's for dependents, maybe it's for someone with a disability. You want to have some control, either during lifetime or after death. So I'd say we use a trust when we don't trust someone for many, many situations.
Okay, we are going to get into some of the potential benefits of a trust shortly, but before we get into that more high-level discussion, Jamie, like big picture, why does somebody, for example, a medical professional, why would they want to open up a trust, a family trust, for example? Just big picture before we jump into the nitty-gritty.
Yeah, I think big picture, unless there's something very specific that you're trying to achieve in terms of, there's someone in the family with a disability, perhaps, you want to protect assets for, or perhaps there are, maybe individuals that you're worried are not good with money and you don't want to give them control of large amounts of money at the same time. Maybe there's an addiction issue, a gambling addiction, a mental health issue, like all kinds of reasons why. Other than those sort of really non-tax reasons, I think the biggest reason we see certainly professionals, entering into taxes, trust is primarily for the tax planning. And again, it depends on your situation, but the opportunity to split income, via a trust. And this was very, very effective a couple of years ago, when something called the prescribed rate loan was 1%. With rates now, in the 5% range, we're not seeing any of that. So, trust can be an effective way. You put investments, you make a loan to a trust, you have investment income in the trust, you pay that out to the kids. And again, if you as long as you charge a minimum prescribed rate, there can be some real interesting income splitting opportunities there, but not as much anymore. For a new trust set up today.
Okay, we're going to get into the income splitting shortly.
Sure.
Right before that, contributing money to a trust or capital to a trust. Are there any limits to the amount that you can contribute to a trust, whether it's over the lifetime or annually, anything like that?
Yeah, not at all. This is just a general trust that you would set up with your lawyer. You'd put out the terms and conditions of that trust, and you can put, as much money as you want or as little as you want into a trust. You can fund some now, and you can fund it later. There's some technical issues you got to be sort of beyond the scope of today, in terms of, you contributing trust later, who the settler is, and some technical things you got to be careful about. But yeah, there's no limitation, and people often put, either property, shares, cash into a trust. Yeah.
Okay, in terms of the type of capital that can go into a trust, are there any big picture limitations on things that a trust can or cannot hold? Or is it pretty open to holding anything?
Yeah, pretty much any asset can be held by a trust as long as it's properly documented. The most common things that we see are cash. A loan is typically made to a trust. Let's say you make $1 million loan to the trust. The trust now issues you a note paying you back. And then the money is sitting in the trust and invested inside the trust. So that's, a common way that assets are funded. People sometimes put residences into a trust, which is something that can be done as well for a certain type of planning. So those are the most common things.
Okay. Now, in terms of the money that goes into the trust, any tax implications up front there? Like when we put money into an RRSP, you get a tax deduction. Is there any tax deduction or tax for money going into a trust?
Yeah, no, not at all. So again, all you're doing is you're transferring the legal ownership of property from you to somebody else. Now, there could be tax implications of the transfer itself. So for example, if you've heard on a podcast that you want to put your cottage into a trust, but your cottage has a huge appreciated gain, that's going to be a problem, right? Because there's a disposition of that asset into the trust, unless it meets certain very specific conditions for things like alter ego trust that we'll talk about. So in other words, there's no real problem. You don't get a tax deduction or anything for the contributions to a trust for a typical trust. However, there could be negative tax implications if you transfer appreciated property into a trust.
Okay. A lot of us, myself included, sometimes our money is hanging around in a professional corporation. Are you allowed to transfer directly from a corporation into a trust?
Well, again, you could have potentially, depending on the structure, and you'd have to check again with all the different provincial authorities what's permitted in terms of shareholders. I mean, theoretically, I guess a trust may, in some situations, you'd have to check the rules. I'm not sure if they're allowed to have shares of a professional corporation, right? I think they typically have to be owned by the professional or their spouse, right? So, I mean, I think some provinces may allow a trust to own shares of a PC, in which case you could have income flowing from the PC up to the trust to the family members. But you've got to be very careful because there were rules that were passed a few years ago federally that try to prevent you from income splitting. So particularly if you've got a non-working spouse that's not involved in the practice, or children that are, sort of under the age of 18, they're not involved, they're not working 20 hours a week somehow in the business, you're very restricted, either directly or indirectly via trust to give them dividends. So a lot of that planning is really no longer available.
Okay. So let's get into some of the potential benefits. Maybe we can start with income splitting. So I had a colleague tell me about income splitting using a trust several years ago. And this was when, in fact, I think the prescribed rate was about 1%. And so ever since he told me that, that seed was planted. And I said, I have to learn about trust. So today, as things stand, can you just go over a basic scenario? Let's talk about it maybe at a bit of a higher level. Like how would income splitting potentially work using a trust?
Yeah, so typically speaking, you may want to split income with your children. So let's say your kids are minor kids, or even if they're adult kids, but you want to split income with them. You're in the top bracket, let's say Ontario, 53.53%. The kids are in a zero bracket because they're in high school, let's say, for example, or even younger, right? Yeah. So they have no income. So one way to income split is just give them all your money and let them invest it, and then they pay tax at their low rate. So the Income Tax Act says if you do that, there's attribution. There's attribution of all that income back to you. So that's not really going to work. The exception in the Income Tax Act says that if we loan the money to our kids, then as long as we charge the prescribed rate, then anything above that prescribed rate can be taxed in the kid's hands. There's no attribution. So a couple of problems with that. First of all, we don't like to make loans to minor children because they're not legal. And therefore, ultimately, there could be problems with collecting on that loan. There could be issues with with children signing debt instruments and things like that. And so we often don't enter into loans with minor kids. They could be unenforceable. So instead, what we do is we set up a trust. So we would set up a family trust, and we'd make a loan to the family trust. And therefore, we could always call the loan back via the trust. The trust then has as its beneficiaries the kids. So the trust earns all the income, pays the 1% or whatever the prescribed rate was at the time that you set it up back to me, and then any rate of return I get above that prescribed rate can then be flowed out to the beneficiaries. And for years, this has been a very popular way until very recently for physicians and all kinds of other professionals to pay for all the kids' private schools. They'd pay for nanny expenses, extracurricular sports, summer vacations, like all kinds of stuff. Because all the trust would have to do is beat a 1% rate of return, which is tax deductible to the trust. Yeah. And anything above that, like a 5% dividend yield, less 1% would be 4%. On $1 million, that's $40,000 of Canadian dividends. And if you pay that to a 16-year-old who has no income, that's all tax-free because of the basic amount in the dividend tax credit. The problem today, if you're listening to this in 2023, after April the 1st, our prescribed rate has now gone up from 1% to 5%.
Oh my God.
And that's a much more challenging discussion, right? Yeah. How can you get a guaranteed rate of return of 5% every year for this strategy even start to make sense? So we're not doing any of this right now. People have really stopped doing this. However, if you were fortunate enough to set up a prescribed rate loan when it was 1 or 2% a few years ago, you don't have to change the rate. That was the rate for life, for the duration of the loan. Right?
Wow. Oh my goodness.
Yeah. Okay. So if you set it up at 1%, you're still at 1%. I mean, that's the good news. And I think most people should just wait. If you haven't set it up before, maybe wait a year or two. If interest rates go down again, then maybe reconsidering. We have clients who did it at 3%, because they were confident they could get, 5, 6, 7, 8% over the long term. But, anything above that, I think you're taking, taking some chances.
Okay, so for the individuals who did set up a trust in time, prescribed rate of 1%, let's say they were using that money in the trust and it was invested into like Canadian blue chip payers. And let's say those were paying out, let's say 5%. So on $1 million, you're getting $40,000 of dividend income. And so that's treated tax efficiently in that way. And so I guess my understanding is if that money, that 40,000 is pulled out of the trust and given to the kids used for expenses directly related to their activities, then it becomes a tax efficient situation. Whereas if the money is left in the trust, then would it just be taxed at the marginal rate? Is that correct?
Well, it'll be taxed at the highest rate. So if you leave income inside of any kind of trust, for the most part, you're looking at the top rate of tax. So in Ontario, for example, on dividend income, if it's from publicly traded companies, it's 39%. If you're paying it out to the kids and the kids have no income and they're using the basic credit and the dividend tax credit for up to about $54,000, the rate is zero. There's actually no tax at all. So it's very, very tax efficient using a Canadian dividend strategy.
Okay, let's say over the next few years, 2, 3, 4 years, maybe the prescribed rate goes back down to 2 to 3%. In a scenario like that, what type of strategies do you see people using for investments inside a trust? Is it dividends, a combination of dividends and fixed income? I'm just curious what you've seen in your practice.
Yeah, typically that's what we see for the most part. I mean, we did have a client even recently, like 6 months ago, that when the prescribed rate was still at 3, we're now at 5. It used to be at 1, but when it was at 3, found a fixed income investment. They were very comfortable. That was at 6. And they locked it in for 5 years. They found some type of note that was paying 6. So they had a guaranteed spread of 3%. Now this client had tens of millions of dollars. So they were able to generate a massive income splitting opportunity for at least the next 5 years. So I think when rates start to come down, you can look at the math and see what it makes sense for you.
Gotcha. Okay. And inside a trust, if you have investments that are accruing capital gains, like how long can you defer those capital gains for?
Well, again, there is something called the 21-year rule of a trust. So any trusts with certain exceptions, but most trusts, when you set up a trust in Canada, there's a deemed disposition of the trust assets on every 21st anniversary. So on the 21st anniversary of the trust, all the assets are deemed to be disposed of. There could be a capital gains tax payable at that time by the trust or paid out to the beneficiaries. But ultimately, most people don't allow that to happen because they either wind up the trust. And the nice thing is that if it's appropriate to do so within 21 years, then you can actually roll out the trust property to the trust beneficiaries at cost without a taxable gain. So in other words, if you bought that Apple stock for, 100,000, and then when you roll it out in 21 years, it's $1 million, you can actually roll out the Apple stock to the beneficiaries at the original 100,000. So the beneficiaries inherit that cost. And therefore, when they sell it later on, they would pay tax on that $1 million proceeds. So, it's something to think about.
Okay, got it. So now what about the opportunity to reduce some taxes at death? Like I've been reading a little bit about the estate freeze, and my understanding is that a trust can sometimes come into action here. But my understanding of this is very, very basic. So maybe you can go over this briefly and literally talk to me as if I have no idea what an estate freeze is, because it's not far from the truth.
Sure. So, I mean, the best example that we see with an estate freeze is someone has an operating company where there's a real market to sell that business. I mean, it's a little bit different depending on the medical profession, right? I think dentists sell businesses all the time, but I'm not so sure that your average physician can sell their practice, so to speak, although maybe there are some opportunities there. But, let's say you've got an operating company and the company is worth, it started off from nothing and now it's worth $1 million. And you're happy that, you can live on $1 million. You could you do an estate freeze where you basically freeze the value of the operating company to $1 million. And the way this is done is that you effectively do a corporate reorganization. You take your common shares, which continue to increase in value as the value of the business goes up, and then you exchange them for fixed value redeemable preferred shares of $1 million. So effectively, you have the right to request $1 million from the company whenever you want because these are redeemable preferred shares. Then you issue new common shares, either directly to the kids or, in our case, to a family trust in which the beneficiaries are the kids. And so effectively what you've done is you've frozen the value of the company to $1 million. So you have the right to get your $1 million. The future growth of that company beyond $1 million will accrue to the new common shares that were just issued that are now owned by the trust.
Got it.
So if this company continues to do really, really well over the next 2, 3, 4 years and grows to be worth, instead of 1 million, 5 million, and then at some point there's a sale to a third party, then that gain, that $5 million, less the 1 million, that $4 million gain would be inside the trust because the trust owns those shares. So if they sold to a third party, the trust would have a $4 million gain, and that trust could then allocate that gain to all the beneficiaries. Let's say the 3 kids and the spouse, that's 4 times $1 million. And right now there happens to be a lifetime capital gains exemption of just under $1 million. So effectively, it's a way to use each of the children's lifetime capital gains exemption on the sale of a qualifying business and receive $4 million, in my case, tax-free. Wow. So it's basically you freeze the value now and you have the future growth accrue to the incoming shareholders of the trust.
Fascinating. You also mentioned just today, and also in your paper that you wrote called In Trusts We Trust, which I think is a great read. And you mentioned various different names of trusts. And when I went to the CRA's website, I think I've seen maybe 30 plus different names of trusts, depending on the reason for which you'd want to open the trust. You mentioned a few like alter ego, joint partner, foreign inheritance. There's a lot out there, Jamie, but in terms of 1 or 2 that we may want to know about, can you speak to us about that, just big picture?
Well, let's touch on those few that you just mentioned. So, for example, the alter ego joint partner trust. These are trusts that are typically used purely for probate planning for the most part, or even as a will substitute. So, for example, in Ontario, typically speaking, there's a 1.5% probate tax on the value of your estate, right? So, if you've got a large estate, then you may wish to consider rolling your assets into the trust. Remember I said earlier that if you transfer assets to a trust, there's a disposition at fair market value. There could be capital gains tax. An exception to that is if you're at least 65 years of age. If you're at least 65, you can roll your property into something called an alter ego trust, which is really a trust for yourself. Yeah. It's fully revocable. You can take the money back anytime you want. And then what happens is your kids could be the beneficiary of this trust after you're gone. So while you're alive, you're the only person that gets all the income and the gain. So there's really no tax play here at all because there's full attribution back to you, all the income, all the gains. But on death, there's a disposition, and then all the assets go directly to the beneficiaries of that trust. They bypass the estate. And because it's not going through the will, the alter ego trust acts as a will substitute, and therefore the assets aren't subject to the 1.5% probate tax, or in Ontario, the estate administration tax, because the assets did not pass via your estate.
Got it.
They went around the estate. You've pre-funded them inside the alter ego trust. So that's one type. Joint partner trust is basically the same thing, but you have both spouses or partners contributing to the same trust, same idea, probate planning. And the third one that you sort of touched on briefly, the foreign inheritance trust, is a really interesting option. Let's say you've got a really wealthy, I mean, for this to make sense, you got to have 10 million plus. So you have a really wealthy relative somewhere offshore. Typically, we see this with relatives in Asia. So they want to leave you $10 million. So, when they die, they leave you $10 million. Great. It's tax-free. Canada doesn't tax foreign inheritances. Take the $10 million, you get it tax-free. The problem is, what do you do with it? So unless you spend the whole $10 million, you're going to invest it. And all this investment income is going to be subject to tax, whatever your marginal rate is. So one thing that you can still do, which is, rare, but it does happen in the right circumstances, is set up a foreign inheritance trust. Now, you don't set it up, but your foreign grandparent or relative would set it up. And instead of leaving you the money directly, they leave it to a trust typically situated in a tax haven like Cayman Islands or some other place that has no local tax. So they leave the $10 million via the Cayman Island Trust. You're the Canadian beneficiary of the trust. Because the money was left offshore, the only tax would be the tax of the local jurisdiction. And if it invests the money in a portfolio, there is no tax in something like Cayman Islands, right?
Right.
So every year you could receive capital distributions from that trust and never pay a cent of tax for the rest of your life. So that's what we call a foreign inheritance trust. It's too late to do this once the person has died.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
again, we do see this in very rare scenarios, but
Okay.
this is something where a trust can still work.
Okay.
I believe, a foreign trust, most foreign trusts, very specific offshore trust rules that tax you as a Canadian, but this is one exception to those rules.
My understanding is that we can also make certain charities beneficiaries of a trust. And my question is, when you came on the pod the first time, you talked about the power of charitable gifting. And I think you touched on the triple benefit when donating from or donating appreciated shares from a corporation to charity.
Correct.
Does a trust also confer any triple benefit like that? Can it be a powerful way to give money to charity?
Well, I mean, not necessarily. I mean, it doesn't have that triple benefit of the capital dividend account, but you don't really need it because there's still full flow through treatment of a trust. So yes, I mean, certainly you could do that. We don't see it very often.
Yeah.
I mean, what we often see more likely is a trust-like vehicle, where you're really operating more like a foundation. So what we often see, and again, it's not really a trust. We also seen very, very popular recently something called the donor advised fund, where someone establishes their own sort of mini fund within a charitable foundation. So whether it's a large hospital foundation or whether it's a university foundation or whether it's a community foundation. And the nice thing about that is you get your tax deduction up front for the credit or from the corporation, whatever you want to do. If you give appreciated securities, of course, there's no capital gains tax. And then, of course, every year you get to decide, you get even though you got your receipt up front, the money can stay and be invested on a tax-free basis inside the foundation. So, it's similar in concept to a trust. I mean, many charities are set up as trusts, but it's a little bit different than the stuff we've been talking about so far. But it's become very, very popular as really a flexible way to give, particularly if you want a tax deduction today, but you're not really sure which charity you want to benefit.
Right.
So you park the money in the foundation, you get your tax break, and then ultimately, on the future, you distribute that to any of the 86,000 registered charities. So it's similar to a trust, but a little bit different.
Jamie, this is great information because donor advised funds and charitable foundations are topics that are going to be upcoming in the next several months. So I'm really happy you planted the seed. Now, you're saying today, because the prescribed rate is quite high and the delta on the returns you might get compared to that prescribed rate aren't as significant. So it sounds like trusts are not being used as much today. What are you kind of seeing big picture? Because trusts is one option, but then other higher level tax planning strategies like permanent life insurance, surplus stripping, charitable gifting, of all of those, like what are you seeing the most of or more of in today's landscape?
Yeah. So in a high net worth space, we're dealing with clients, let's say 25 million or more. I mean, really, there's not a lot left once they've done the RSPs and the TFSAs and they've done all the debt and all that. So things like permanent insurance, typically whole life insurance strategies. We call it insurance for people who don't need insurance, right? That's very, very effective. I think that works really well. Setting up a donor advised fund to make substantial charitable gifts in high tax years, setting yourself up for a lifetime or even generationally in terms of future gifting is certainly another strategy. And then I would just add that, even though we're not seeing the trust set up so much for income splitting today, we're still seeing trusts set up every week. And they're setting up for the non-tax reasons, the ability to have control, especially in cases with second marriages or multiple families, and you want to protect assets for the kids of the first marriage rather than leaving it to the new spouse or partner. We're seeing a trust work very effectively there. That could be part of the will, right, where the money goes, in your will, some of it goes to the current spouse, some of it goes to the kids. It can be done using a testamentary trust as part of a will. We're seeing it in the cases of providing for kids that are not good with money. They might spend the money. They may have addiction issues, things like that. So I think trusts are as popular as ever. We're just not seeing it so much on the tax side in the last 6 months because of the rise of the prescribed rate. But trusts are still a very valuable part of an estate plan because they provide many, many non-tax benefits that you cannot achieve otherwise.
I'm glad you commented on that. Last thing, I know for the foreign inheritance trust, you mentioned a foreign relative maybe being very, very wealthy. But let's say years down the road when the prescribed rate comes down and then trusts are used more for income splitting purposes, what type of client would you see benefiting from this? Because I want listeners to be able to at least walk away from this and be able to say, would this be useful for me one day? Like, would this be more for clients who have multiple hundreds of thousands of dollars of like personal cash lying around, or are you seeing it used by people who maybe have like 50 to 100,000 kind of lying around? They want to
Definitely
use it for
not.
kids.
No one's doing this for 50 or 100,000. I've never seen it done under $500,000, to be honest with you.
Okay.
So I'd say if you got $500,000 of cash lying around, and you're in a high bracket, and your kids have lots of expenses, and they're in zero brackets, that's the perfect scenario. That's where we see these type of things used. Most of these prescribed rate loans are in the $1 million range, million, 2 million, that type of thing. That's where I see most of the benefit from these prescribed rate loans, especially via a trust.
Jamie, that was amazing information. Thank you for everything that you do. We all love to follow you, and I just want to kind of leave it open at the end. Is there anything that we missed on trusts or anything at all in general?
Well, look, I think that tax planning is something that people should be doing all year. I mean, even though we're sort of recording this today in tax season, with a May 1st deadline for generally and a June 15th for professionals that have self-employment income. Now is really not the time to try to fix last year's taxes, 2022. There's really not much you can do, right? You can maybe share some donations or some medical expenses on your return, but maybe pension splitting. There's not much you can do with your return, right? But now is a great time to really sit down, maybe after busy season, sit down with your tax professional and let's look at 2023. What can we do in 2023 to save taxes throughout the rest of the year? We still have, 7 months left of the year. So what are we going to do for the rest of 2023? Are we being tax efficient? Is our portfolio tax efficient? Are we looking at the whole family situation? Are we maximizing all the registered plans? We have a brand new plan coming this year, right? The First Home Savings Account.
That's right.
So for anyone in the family with children that, are 18 years of age, it's an interesting opportunity to gift them the $8,000 a year to tax deductible to them to contribute up to $40,000 to fund a down payment for first home. So there's always new opportunities for FHSAs, for TFSAs, for wealth transfer. And these are conversations I believe we should have all year round, not just in tax season.
Jamie, I love it. I can't thank you enough for taking the time again to speak with me and to educate us.
Thank you.
Okay, take care. I hope that was a useful overview of trusts. Stay tuned in the coming months when we talk about the legal aspects of trusts. If you can't tell, I absolutely love making this podcast, and I love connecting with all of you. This podcast has opened the door to so many friendships and meaningful connections, so reach out anytime, beyondmdpodcast@gmail.com, or connect with me on LinkedIn. If you don't have time to listen to each episode in entirety, I also am releasing short snippets of the podcast on YouTube. The channel is Beyond MD. And if you like what you're hearing, please feel free to spread the word with 2 people in your network. I'll see you in a few weeks when I talk about my money mistakes and what I've learned. So until next time, stay well, stay savvy.